Hello, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. My name is Colin Mustful, the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press that publishes historical novels. Welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. This is a regular panel series that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. So I'm really excited to um, introduce you to these authors and their books. And this is going to be a really fun event. It's going to go pretty quickly, but I've got plenty of questions here to talk to our panelists about their novels. Just a couple things to start off. Your cameras, you can open and close them as you like. Your mics will not be able to be open just to limit any distractions. However, you can say hello in the chat, and I would encourage you to do so. Please say hello. Let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what you're reading right now, anything like that. This event is being recorded. I'm going to share the recording on our YouTube channel and on our webpage afterwards. And I also have a landing page with all of our authors' novels, and that landing page connects with bookshop.org. So I'm going to post that in the chat right now. If at any time you want to take a look at the synopsis of the novels, you can find it there. And then if you want to head over to bookshop.org and purchase a novel, you can do that. We like Bookshop because it gives a percentage of the sale back to independent booksellers, so that helps promote independent bookstores. Finally, just thank you for taking part of this and attending. It is a free event, but we also accepted donations as a part of the registration. So thank you for those people that did contribute, because that helps pay for the Zoom platform and the Eventbrite platform. So we really appreciate that. It helps us to continue to host these events. All right, without further ado, I'm going to take myself off of the screen and just have our panelists on there. And let's start with Susan Meissner. If you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you are. Yes, I'm Susan Meissner. I write historical fiction for Berkeley. I believe I've just finished my 10th book for them. I'm really happy to be writing in that genre. I feel like history is a tutor. It teaches us about who we are, what we love, what we hate, what we fear, what we are all about. My newest book is A Map to Paradise. It comes out on Tuesday, the 18th, and it's set in 1956 in Malibu at the start of the beginning years of the Cold War. So it's a post-World War II book about three women who are all feeling a sense of displacement for different reasons. And they're going to become rather unlikely friends and allies when their secrets begin to fall apart.
Thank you, Susan. I think this might be the third time we've hosted you. I know I had you at least one other time, but this might be the third. So thank you for being a frequent guest.
Great to be back.
Next, let's say hello to Fiona Davis. Fiona, hi, and if you could tell us about your novel.
Hi. So yes, I'm thrilled to be here. So my next book is my new book is The Stolen Queen. It's set at the Met Museum in New York City. I write historical fiction that's set in iconic New York City buildings. So the Met was the choice for this one. And it's a story that takes place in 1978. And it's from the point of view of a very serious 60-year-old curator in the Egyptian wing who unwillingly is teamed up with her complete opposite, basically an overeager 19-year-old assistant to the Met Gala. And they have to team up to track down a stolen artifact that they're both very personally invested in. And I like to say it's about mothers and daughters. It's about female friendships. Part of it takes place in the 1930s in Egypt when the archaeologist Charlotte was a young woman. And it's got a lot of hidden secrets and of course, deadly curses. And I realized when I was touring this book that it's best described as a mix of Thelma and Louise meets Indiana Jones meets The Devil Wears Prada.
That's awesome.
That's definitely very intriguing. Well, thank you, Fiona. Next, we have J.E. Weiner, author of The Wretched and Undone, which is actually published by History Through Fiction and our imprint HTF Publishing. Julia, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Sure. Well, I'm just thrilled to be here with these three other women who I have been following closely as I head into my debut novel release on Tuesday, the 18th, along with Susan, Wretched and Undone. This is my first venture into fiction writing. It is a searing Southern Gothic saga with a sprinkle of Western, maybe more than a sprinkle of Western, and a sprinkle of Texas noir as far as the genre is concerned. I love the sort of mashup idea. I think think Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian meets Flannery O'Connor's It's Hard to Find a Good Man meets A Good Man is Hard to Find, rather, meets the Coen brothers' Ballad of Buster Scruggs. So it's got a dark themes and supernatural themes that are characteristic of the Southern Gothic genre. It takes place in Bandera, Texas, which doesn't get more Western than that. And lots of cowboys, lots of damsels in distress, lots of not great people. And then it also has a healthy dose of gallows humor. And so I think it is a story. It's an immigrant tale cast in a Western, which can also be a story, a quintessential American story. It also lifts up voices of quirky characters that came into view as I researched this book, not least of which are a pair of Arab camel wranglers who are actually based on real life men who came over to run the U.S. Camel Corps in Camp Verde, which is just north of Bandera. So it's a family saga, and I'm just really excited to be here today to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, definitely a lot of surprises in your novel that I didn't know anything about. So that's one thing I love about historical fiction, especially like regional fiction that can show things that we wouldn't otherwise know. Finally, we have Penny Ha. Penny, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel, Follow Me to Africa.
Yes, hi, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a former journalist who, in the last 8 years, has turned to writing fiction and am absolutely loving it. Follow Me to Africa is my third biographical historical fiction with Sourcebooks Landmark. So I'm published in the US. And it is inspired by the story of Mary Leakey, who was the archaeologist and paleoanthropologist who was British born, but spent most of her life in East Africa. And it tells the story of Mary work, but I have introduced a teenage foil to her story. So it's a dual timeline, and the 17-year-old who arrives at the dig when Mary is 70 and is busy packing up her camp. So she's packing up 50 years of extraordinary work that she's conducted at a place called Old Dubai Gorge in Tanzania. And this young girl is there with her father, and Mary enlists her to help her pack up her goods. And the two form something of a friendship. And my young fictional character, because obviously Mary Leakey is based on a true person, but I introduce a fictional character, is essentially a foil for Mary to reflect on her life and to tell her story to this younger girl who has her own difficulties. And the two form an interesting friendship. It's about intergenerational friendship. It's about thinking about your life and realizing what you've done and examining your choices. And it's also a way of celebrating the extraordinary work that Mary Leakey did to teach us about our ancestors. So yeah, follow me to Africa.
Thank you, Penny. I think one thing from hearing all of you is there's a lot of commonalities in your stories. So I think
Yes.
that's going to make some really interesting conversation. Let's start with Susan. I actually want to ask you about something you brought up here in our little pre-meeting. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between your main characters, Melanie, Ava, and June, and how it was. Well, first of all, maybe you could tell us about that relationship and how they're interconnected and complex, but you also talked about some of the challenges you had in developing those complex relationships. So can you talk about what the relationships are and then how you in your craft were able to develop them?
Sure. Well, the three stars of this show, if you will, are Melanie Cole. She's a blacklisted actress. This is the era of McCarthyism, which was rampant in Hollywood, of all places. There was a serious witch hunt for communists and communist sympathizers in Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s. And she's caught up in that. She is not a communist, but she knows one. And back then, that was enough to land you on the blacklist if you were suspected at all of being a sympathizer. She's hiding out in Malibu to stay away from the press and prying eyes, and to be harder to find if someone's going to hand her a subpoena to testify in Washington, D.C., which she does not want to do. So she's living next door to a woman named June, who's a widow. She's caring for her agoraphobic brother-in-law. He's a screenwriter. She was married to his brother. He does not leave the house, hasn't left the house in a decade for reasons that pop up in the book. She's in love with him. But that's not her biggest problem. Her biggest problem is she has nothing if he dies, absolutely nothing. Her husband left her nothing, and he's not well. And then Melanie's housekeeper is the third person in this tale. Her name is Ava. She's an Eastern European who immigrated to the US during the years when we were trying to help the displaced people camps in Europe. We were trying to help empty those. There are 11 million people left homeless after the war, and about 1 million of them could not return to their Eastern European countries. For a lot of them, if they did, it meant they could be arrested, executed, or deported to a gulag. So she's one of those. She lost everybody and everything in the war. So she's already been displaced from everything that defines her. The other two are facing it. And so they come together on this little Malibu cul-de-sac. They have nothing in common except the fact that they're either facing the loss of home, or it's happened already, or it looks like it's right around the corner. And that's what draws them together. And then they find out they really are rather loyal to the people they care about. And that comes about as they become friends for rather unlikely reasons. And the trouble I had with these characters is how much to bring in of their backstory. That was part of it. And I think what I needed to do, and I didn't realize it until I had done it, was I needed to write everything about their backstory in these very long chapters that never made it into the book. Well, they did make it in. I had to cut them out. But I needed to know that backstory to find out. We bring to our adult lives everything that happened to us in our younger years. And a lot of it's really formative. And that's why it stays with us beyond, say, maybe our young adult years. Our childhood years, they're important, and they form who we are and how we think. So I needed to write a lot of those chapters and then read them and internalize them and then let them go, to be able to write these characters so that they came across the page to you as being authentic. I wanted them to feel authentic, but I didn't realize that I had to write all of that hard stuff, get it on the page, and then take it off the page to make them come alive.
Yeah, there's a lot of background work that goes in that maybe readers don't quite understand. And I know working with Julia, I know Julia, you had to cut quite a bit from the original story.
That's absolutely true.
Well, let's go to Fiona. Fiona, I want to ask you about Charlotte and Annie. And my interpretation of dual timelines are usually separate. The timelines relate to one another, but you don't see characters cross over. So can you talk about having the younger character in the earlier timeline, then writing them in the new timeline? Obviously, it's the same person, but many years have passed. They've changed. They've learned a lot. Can you talk about those challenges?
Yeah, the structure of this book was more complicated than any of my others. I'm not quite sure what I was thinking. So there, in the first half of the story, we have Charlotte at 60 years old in 1978. You have Annie at 19 years old in 1978. And then every so often we go back to Charlotte as a young woman in the 1930s in Egypt. And I wanted to do that to show Charlotte as a 60-year-old is kind of very tightly wound, closed off. And I wanted to show what she was like as a young woman, to see, so that readers wondered, how do you get there? How do you get from this young, enthusiastic, just, wide-eyed girl to this woman who has clearly been through a lot? And I thought that would be a really interesting contrast. And I also thought it was fascinating the way the archaeologists worked in Egypt in the 1930s. And I wanted to bring that into the story. And then, of course, we have Annie in 1978, and she is taking care of her mom. She gets this dream job working at the Met for Diana Vreeland, putting on the Met Gala, and she's completely unqualified. And so in the first half, we get these 3 points of view and 2 timelines. And then the Met Gala happens about halfway through, and it's a disastrous experience, which was really fun to write. And that kind of takes the 2 of them off on the hunt for the stolen artifact, where we're in one timeline, 1978, but going back and forth between Annie and Charlotte. And Charlotte is 60, of course. And I think what I really want to do whenever I'm doing that kind of comparison is to show how women's voices and agency have changed over time and how they haven't. And so you can see what it was like for Charlotte as a young archaeologist, as a woman, which was very rare in the 1930s, and how hard it was, how many of her accomplishments were, usurped by the men who she worked with, and how frustrating that was. And then later, in her 60s, she's working at the Met as an associate curator. She's doing all of the work, but getting none of the glory. That all goes to her boss, who's a male curator. And so I just find those comparisons very interesting. And so I love to write them in. And then on top of that, because Charlotte is doing all this research on this rare female pharaoh, you also get a comparison of ancient Egypt and what that was like for a woman versus a woman in 1978. And it was fascinating because in ancient Egypt, a woman could get divorced. She could own property. If she got divorced, she could keep her kids. She could have a child out of wedlock. It was much freer. In the 1970s in America, a woman couldn't get a loan or a mortgage without a man co-signing with her. And I just find that fascinating. And I love to bring that out, but not in a preachy way, in a way that the reader hopefully goes, oh, wow, I had no idea. And just, I hope, makes it see how far we've come and how far we still have to go in a very spotlighted way.
Yeah, definitely a very important element of historical fiction, allowing us to look back with hindsight and kind of see that history is not always linear. And even now, 50 some years on from 1970, we could take another look and see, where we're going, where we've been. I think that's really valuable. Well, Julia, let's go to you. Your novel actually is linear in time, but it expands 3 generations. So can you talk about encapsulating all of that history from 1865 to the 1920s and being able to keep it tight enough to fit within the narrative?
Sure. Well, what's really interesting as well, the book is written somewhat linearly. We start in 1987 in the prologue. A country music starlet wanders in to a quirky little actual real museum that is in the town of Bandera, Texas, called the Frontier Times, and says, help me, I've bought this ranch, I think it's haunted. And the story then cascades back to the eve of the Civil War. And moves forward, actually a little further than the 1920s. It moves into the Second World War. And it was an interesting exercise because I actually researched this in reverse. Who is this woman? Why is she coming to this museum? What's going on? Who are the pictures of these people, namely Polish settlers who founded the town? Where did they come from? Why did they come here? And why did they stay? Because it was still, even now to this day, a pretty scrappy piece of land in the Texas Hill Country. And then really unfolding through both historical documents, memoirs, which are quite available, in particular in this area. People like to write a lot in Texas about their history, their families' histories, being able to read those. I'm a little jealous of Fiona's tales of being able to trace the women's imprint in this historical arc. Women don't have a lot of voices here. You have to read between the lines. A lot of the biographies are 3/4 of a page or a quarter of a page, where the men's stories are like 10, 20 pages long in some of the materials that I found. And so working my way back, it was almost in reverse. Like, how did we get here? And what was the step before this and the step before this? And only when I did that in the research was I able to sort of have the foresight to how the story was going to have to play out. And it really is a tale of immigration. It's a tale of otherness. It's a tale of ultimately assimilation in a place that really was a crucible at a time of history and brought together lots of different peoples, whether it was immigrants. Few people know that the port of Galveston was almost as busy as Ellis Island in processing immigrants in the mid 1800s coming from places like Poland. Everyone says, who knew there were Poles in Texas? There were Poles, there were Germans, there were Jews, there were slaves, there were freedmen, there were Arab camel wranglers. It really was this incredible synergy and node in history and time at several junctures. And so it really was unpacking, discovering, and then being able to have the vision forward to be able to write this family's story, I think, is the process that I went through.
Thank you, Julia. I had Julia on my podcast, and I just love hearing you actually talk about the nuts and bolts behind the story. So that's really fascinating. I have gotten a couple questions already. So for Lauren, I will get to those once in a little bit later in the program here. So thank you for posting those questions. If anyone in the audience has a question, just hang on to those for now, and we'll get to those here before the end of the event. Next, let's go to Penny. Let's go off of a little bit what Fiona was talking about, because Penny, you have kind of the same thing going on here with the dual timeline and characters appearing in both timelines. Can you talk about your strategy behind that, how it enhanced the narrative, and what some of the challenges were?
Yeah, it resonates to hear Fiona saying that some of these things are a challenge. But the reason that I chose to do the dual timeline, my other historical fiction is written in the first person. I took on the voices of Aileen Cust, who was Britain and Ireland's first woman veterinary surgeon, and then Bertha Benz, who was the wife of Carl Benz in the next one. But when I wanted to write about Mary Leakey, she already has an autobiography. And because she is widely published as an academic, her research is widely available, I felt that I couldn't assume her voice. Her voice is already, her written voice is already out there. So I decided to write it in the third person. And when I was thinking about how I might handle the story, I was listening to an interview, and I heard the interviewer ask the subject a question that one hears quite often, definitely this side of the world anyways. What would you tell your teenage self? And that got me thinking, and I had read Mary's autobiography, which is a beautiful book called Disclosing the Past. And she was very British in her in many of her mannerisms. So she withheld a lot of her emotions. She reminded me quite a lot of my grandmother, who was British. You know, it was a case of having a stiff upper lip and what have you. And so I thought, having heard that interview, I thought, I wonder what Mary would answer to that question. What would you tell your teenage self? So that was what led me to introduce a teenager, someone that she could essentially mentor and perhaps recognize parts of her younger self in. And I also wanted to, because I felt that everything that she has, everything that's on record about her life is quite restrained. As I say, I think the kind of person that she was, she loved her work. She was passionate about her work, and she didn't like to talk a lot about it. She liked to do her work. But I thought if there was an opportunity where she needed to actually connect with someone emotionally, how would it be? And that was why I introduced the fictitious 17-year-old, because I wanted Mary to reflect on her own life. So I have these two stories. Mary's story starts in the 1930s, essentially, when she meets Louis Leakey, which is the reason that she comes to Africa. He's an up-and-coming archaeologist and paleoanthropologist. And so her life begins there, and Grace, the fictitious character, comes into the scene when she's 17. So the two stories run side by side, but they're overlapping all the time, because Mary's essentially recognizing herself in this younger girl, and she's also recognizing how she can mentor the young girl. So that's how the dual timeline works for me. But at the same time, I needed there to be some action and adventure for my young 17-year-old. So while she's in Africa with Mary, they rescue a cheetah which arrives in the camp, which is based on a cheetah that actually did arrive in Mary Leakey's camp at Old Dubai at some point. All the animals in my book are completely factual. Mary Leakey loved animals, which was one of the things that drew me to her. And so I obviously moved the time that this cheetah arrived, and I bring the cheetah in when my fictitious character's there. So there's something of an adventure story at the same time, which is part of the bonding of Mary and the younger character.
Thank you, Penny. Yeah, a lot of elements that you're mixing together there, and kind of also revealed where the origin of the title, Follow Me to Africa, makes a lot more sense there. Let's go back to Susan. Susan, I want to ask you about your setting in 1956 Malibu. If you could talk about how you chose that setting, how you utilize that setting. And then we also had a question here from Lauren about a natural disaster that occurs, which obviously would be part of the setting, and how that influences the arc of your characters.
Right. Well, I knew I needed a Hollywood adjacent location because of my actress being blacklisted and hiding out in Malibu. She wanted to be close to Hollywood, but not real close. Malibu was a great choice because a lot of Hollywood actors would go there. They had beach homes there and kind of get away from the rat race. That's where they went. It's about a 45-minute-ish drive from LA, from Hollywood. So that worked. And also too, Malibu is a beautiful, idyllic, kind of rough and rugged, but beautiful at the same time. It's a 20-mile stretch of beach and foothills. And it might be even called it's paradise already. So who needs a map to paradise if you're already living in it? But if it's not paradise for you, then it doesn't really matter how beautiful your view is outside your window if you're feeling like everything that defines you is being taken from you. So it worked metaphorically, it worked geographically, and it worked historically because Hollywood stars did go out to Malibu for their weekends and had their beach homes there. And it helps to kind of frame the desires of these women to all reclaim their sense of belonging. It serves to give a sense of, there's a lot of angst going on inside these women, and yet the setting allows them to, like, if the setting can talk, it would say, how can I help you? I'm here for you. And it gives us a sense of, there's a sense of beauty there. Malibu is famously known as the wildfire capital of North America. I'm sad to say that that is true. And when I was writing this book, there was no way for me to know that in January of 2025, we would have the catastrophic losses that the Pacific Palisades, which is Malibu's next door neighbor, and Malibu would experience. And my heart goes out to everybody who experienced loss in those fires, and Altadena too, of course. There was a wildfire in Malibu in 1956. It does show up in the book because Malibu usually has some sort of catastrophic wildfire, 2 of them every decade since the 1920s. It's just the situation where it's seated geographically with the hills and the way the winds come across from the east, which is not where winds usually come. The Santa Ana winds are very different. And they're called devil winds for a reason. They're rather hellish kinds of winds, and they often stir up and cause wildfires. And a wildfire that is in an area where our people are living, what it wants is it wants your home. And so metaphorically, I'm using that too, is that the fire that's going to come to Malibu when these women are living there wants the same thing as other forces that are out against them, and that is it wants to take what belongs to you. And so again, my heart goes out to everybody in LA who experienced loss this fire season. But the fire in Malibu 1956 was a real event, and it does show up in the book.
That's interesting. Yeah, it never I've lived in Minnesota, and wildfires aren't a part of our natural disasters around here. So it's not something I often think about. So I'm surprised to hear that it happens twice a year, as you meant, or twice a decade.
Twice a
So
decade, yeah.
yeah, so that's incredible. But um, I think that's interesting how you used it as a metaphor for your characters. So, well, let's go back to Fiona. Let's talk about your settings. So we have 1970s Met Gala, kind of upper class, really glamorous, and then you have Valley of the Kings in Egypt, 1930s archaeology. You mentioned in our pre-meeting how fun it was to research for this novel. So talk about bringing those settings to life and why that was fun for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. This is the first book that I've set outside of New York City. And I didn't go to New Jersey. I went to Egypt. Like I really went for it. And it was really a wonderful research process. We traveled there a couple years ago and spent about 10 days going through Cairo, seeing the pyramids, going up the Nile, going to the Valley of the Kings, you walking into King Tut's tomb. It was pretty incredible. And I knew I had to do that because I wanted to be able to really have the reader feel like they were there as well, and really ground them in the setting. So, for example, sometimes the sand would cover the sun and everything would turn this kind of crazy orange color. And being able to describe that, having been there, was helpful, and what things taste like, what it smells like, what it sounds like. And then, of course, I'd done some research. There's a wonderful book called Empress of the Nile by Lynn Olson about a young archaeologist, excuse me, from France who was there in the 1930s. And she described that when you would go to sleep in a tent in the desert, you'd sleep on a cot. And before you went to bed, you'd put cups of water under the legs of the cot so that the scorpions couldn't climb up. And to me, that kind of detail is just, that's what I'm looking for, because I want something to anchor the reader where they are and make them feel like they're actually in Egypt with me. So that was wonderful. And then 1970s New York, I chose because it would make my character 60 years old. And in 1978, it was right after the Temple of Dendur was open to the public at the Met. And also, you had the King Tut exhibit about to happen in December. So the book takes place in November, so it's right in between those. So there's a lot of pressure on everybody. And then, of course, you have the Met Gala, which is this, fabulous evening. And the research for that was really interesting. For everything to do with the Met, I interviewed as many people as I could who worked there, from security guards to docents to curators to technicians to handlers to Met staffers, just to get a sense of what it's like, because it really is almost like a small city within New York City. And then with the Met Gala, it was looking at what it was like in the 70s. And that's when Deanna Vreeland took over. And most of the book are fictional characters. Deanna Vreeland is a real person and a real character in the book, because you couldn't top her. If you invented a character, it wouldn't even be close. She was this whirlwind, this tornado of a woman, a fashion icon. She was editor for Vogue. And when she took over the Met Gala, she brought in Mick Jagger and Diana Ross and, made it into this huge party of the year, which is, of course, how we know it now. And so it was such a funny thing to go from Egypt, where it was 90 something degrees. We were dripping with sweat. I was following our tour guide around and writing down everything he said. And then, researching the Met Gala and what was with the red carpet and what that was like. And I love the idea that these are two very different things, but they're both at the Met, and the Met is the building that really houses them, which is just a kind of crazy, it's pop culture and ancient art.
Well, thank you. I think it's really interesting to hear all the work that goes into writing a novel. You can't just sit down and write. It's not just editing. You have to do the legwork and, like you said, creating that authenticity that you cannot get anywhere else. So I think that's really great. Julie, we have a question from Lauren. You have a unique perspective among our panelists in that this is your debut. And I'm sure we have some writers in our audience. So maybe you could speak to this a little bit about your experience querying, identifying publishers, signing with us, and just what that whole process has been like for you.
Well, it's been an adventure, I will say. I do think that traditional publishing lanes are so narrow these days. I think the barriers to entry are so high, and yet there are so many amazing stories out there that need to be told. And if you're not fitting the soup du jour of what is of interest to traditional publishing and agents, it's very, very difficult to sort of emerge out of, I guess they call it the slush pile. And so I did my fair share of trying to go the traditional route. And then I had a very good friend who consults and works on self-published books say, have you thought about small presses? Those have really been a new lane and places where if you're not interested yet in thinking about self-publishing, there could be some opportunities for a match with your work. And so I did that. And 6 weeks after I decided to give that a try, I heard from you, Colin. And that was really it just takes one yes. That's the other truism in this business. It just takes one yes and someone to believe in you as a writer and you as a story and in your story. And so that's really happened for me, but it took a long time. It took about 18 months, 2 years of really putting it out there and putting myself out there in a way that was not natural. I don't come to this as a writer by profession. I come to this as something that I discovered about myself along the way, and something that has come to be somewhat of an obsession. And if I could quit my day job, I would in a heartbeat, because I just love this so much. So I think it's really about being patient, giving it a try so that you could say that you gave it a try. Maybe you get lucky, but probably not. And so really thinking about other ways in which you can get your story out there and being patient and not judging yourself too harshly because they probably didn't even really read your query letter or really read your submission. And so they haven't really judged it on the merits. It's just a volume call. And so that's what's really been empowering for me, and to have some agency as well in the way that my story was told. You all still made me cut a bunch of parts in the book, but that's okay. They'll come back in the sequel. That was also a great learning experience, but this has been incredibly empowering, I would say, for me. And again, it's about reclaiming agency for yourself and your art. That has been a truly wonderful learning experience for me.
Thank you. I think that's a good reminder for people out there that, I mean, speaking from our side of the table, it is kind of a volume game at times where it's just, are you the right fit? Is it the right relationship kind of a thing? And sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but we've been very happy to work with you. Let's go to Penny here. Actually, I have to admit, I don't know much about Mary Leakey. So could you go a little bit more in depth about who she is and why we should know about her?
So Mary Leakey was married to Louis Leakey, and Louis Leakey was the man who first challenged the theory that humankind evolved in Europe or Asia. And Louis Leakey was also British, but he was born in Kenya, which is in East Africa, to missionary parents. And he was inducted to the Kikuyu tribe, which is a indigenous tribe in Kenya. And he grew up wandering across the wilderness with his friends, and he found many stone tools, and he recognized that these tools were similar to the kind of tools that archaeologists were examining and researching in other parts of the world. And it made him think that perhaps mankind actually evolved in Africa rather than in Europe, or as scientists believed back then. So that was in the 1920s, perhaps in Asia. And he went to Cambridge. He studied to be an archaeologist there, and as a young man, he challenged scientists about their belief that our human ancestors evolved in Europe and in Asia. And Mary Leakey, one of the things that's very fascinating about her, there are so many things fascinating about her. Her father was a landscape artist she was born in 1990. He was a British landscape artist, and they traveled. He would go to the continent, to Italy and to France in summer, and paint landscapes, and then go back to England and sell his stock, and then travel again. And one of the consequences of this was that Mary didn't get a formal education in her early life. She was essentially taught by her father, and he died when she was 13. Her mother took her back to England and tried to get her into a schooling system, but she was a rebellious girl, and she got expelled from 2 convents, and her mother was so embarrassed by her behavior that she gave up. So this young girl was essentially didn't have a traditional schooling, but her father had taught her to illustrate. And one of the things that archaeologists needed at that period was good illustrators, and that was how she met Louis Leakey. She was an illustrator, and she was interested in archaeology, and they fell in love. He was married to someone else, so it was quite scandalous at the time in Britain. In fact, they were essentially shunned by the academic circle in Cambridge and Oxford, and they returned to Africa. It was always their plan, because she was interested in his theory that man evolved in Africa, and she came to East Africa, and they did years and years, decades and decades of research, and they have some extraordinary findings. Mainly, what they were looking for were evidence, so fossil evidence of mankind's evolution in Africa. And Mary discovered several skulls that belonged to the Australopithecus genre, it's often referred to as the missing link between humans and the ape. She also discovered footprints that had been created in the tuff, which is the volcanic ash which was close to Olduvai, which proved that our ancestors were bipedal. We were walking on 2 legs long before other researchers had believed. So she has done this most extraordinary research, and most of it was done in the early stage, was done in the shadow of her husband, who was a very charismatic man. He loved the spotlight. They attracted fabulous funding from the National Geographic with various finds. He spent a lot of time in the US talking about their research. And Mary was essentially the self-taught scientist who did most of the work. She was quietly working in the background until his death. And so my story is really a celebration of what an extraordinary woman she was, a woman with, as I say, less than 2 years of formal education, whose scientific methods and whose work is exceptional. I mean, she is one of the best known archaeologists or women archaeologists and paleoanthropologists in the world. And many of her methods and techniques, her archaeological techniques, are followed to this day, and they're all self-taught. She received many awards and honorary university degrees later in her life, but she said she earned her accolades working in the sun, and her work is exceptional. I mean, I found it absolutely fascinating to find out more about her, and I hope that readers do too.
Wow, yeah, that's very inspiring to make so many scientific breakthroughs like that, and in the shadow of someone else, and then to be able to do it without that formal education. That's amazing. Well, I'm getting some questions here from the audience. I'd like to invite all of our attendees, if you have a question, go ahead and post them, and I'll kind of sort through them and continue to facilitate the panel here. Let me post a link one more time to that landing page with all of our panelists' books if you want to go check those out. I'm going to see if I can combine Linda and Lauren's question here. So it starts with Linda asking about how to cover yourself legally when history's not that far back. You're dealing with people and places that still exist, if there's any legal implications there. And then Lauren goes on to ask really about using real people, real instead of fictional characters. How much do you change them to fit the narrative? How much can you change them to fit the narrative? So Fiona, maybe if you could start us off on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. For me, I rarely use real people in my books. I tend to do the research and use that history as a scaffolding to layer a fictional story over. But every so often, for example, writing about the Frick collection, I need to include the Frick family. And in terms of legality, if they're dead, you can write anything you want. If you're alive, I'd be more careful. But most of my characters, they've been, long gone. And I'm very lucky with the Frick. I try to make them three-dimensional characters, even though they're very complicated people. And I was lucky in that a Frick descendant reached out to me and asked me to tea and said she loved the book. And she showed me pictures of her Aunt Helen, who's a major character in that book. And it was just really rewarding and wonderful to have that exchange. But what I try to do, no matter what, for example, in The Stolen Queen, there's an actual pharaoh named Hatshepsut who is the inspiration for my pharaoh, Hathor Kare, in the book. And I kept it as Hatshepsut through a number of drafts, and then I realized I had to change it because I was having my character Charlotte do all of this work of uncovering these fascinating details about her, about finding her mummy, when actual scholars and researchers had done that work. And I thought that just wasn't right. And so I changed the name. And in the author's note, in every book, I make it very clear what's fact, what's fiction, what inspired me, where I went down rabbit holes, and hopefully to send readers down those rabbit holes as well to learn more, because I think half the fun of reading historical fiction.
Well, it can be hard to finish the book sometimes because you're looking up facts. Penny, anything to add to that?
Yes, yeah, I get asked that question. It's a lovely question, and I always say, because all of my work is biographical historical fiction, so it is based on real people, and I feel that it's my responsibility to keep the facts that are known on public record true, because people can check them and what have you, and I have to be as thorough as possible in my research. So I need to know as much as I know, and those facts have to be true. But because we don't know people's conversations, their thoughts, their emotions, and what have you, that's where one has a license to speculate. And yeah, I don't feel worried about upsetting anyone, because my overall objective is to celebrate these subjects that I've chosen. They're trailblazing women who have essentially their achievements have gone unsung. So I feel like I'm singing their achievements. And I've had a similar experience to what Fiona was talking about, where I've had relations or relatives of alien caste who, in fact, when I was researching the book, I couldn't find anyone who was directly related to her, but I had some people who were related to her guardian contact me from Britain and just say how much they loved the fact that I had celebrated her life this way, and it really is a wonderful thing. But aside from feeling like my objective is to celebrate these women, I'm also trying to entertain readers. So, as I was saying earlier, that with the story of Lisa the cheetah, this was a real cheetah that Mary knew, but she knew the cheater at a different time to where I brought the cheater into the book, and I'm hoping that the cheater's relatives won't be in touch with me complaining about that. But
Oh, they will.
They might also think that I celebrated the cheater. But yeah, I mean, so as I say, I try to stay as true to the research as I can. So everything that's in public record, I feel that I need to have that in the book. But I'm also, I also reveal everything in my author's note at the back of the book, where I say, this is an imagined character, you know, and I introduced the character because I felt that this was how it worked. But I love that idea of people being fascinated by these women and going and saying how much of this is true. And I love the fact that many of them write to me and say, we were amazed to find out how much was true. And I go, yeah, that's why you choose these characters, you know.
Well said. Thank you, Penny. Well, we have a question from Becky, and I think this can apply for Susan and Julia, or anyone really, but she asks about cutting elements of the novel, because both Susan and Julia had mentioned that, and how that those sacrifices of cutting can maybe enhance the novel, but also you're killing your darling, so to speak. So either one of you, maybe Julie, if you could start off on what that was like for you, and how it actually works to enhance the novel.
Sure. Well, I've come around to the realpolitik of how one puts a book together, and there are certain page numbers beyond which it's very difficult for people to sort of accept your book, particularly when you're a debut author. I will say, I think you get a little more leash if you've been out there for a little while on the length of your book. Something that was very difficult for me is that a lot of the sections that were the voice of the women in the characters. So initially I had 4 parts. All right, that was already challenging. And in each part, the primary male and the primary female had equal voice, or relatively equal voice in each, for different perspectives. And it was pointed out that the women's narratives were very much sort of the texture and more the deepening, or the making things a little more horizontal, but the action was moving more clearly, more dramatically through the males' voices. And so that was a really hard decision that I had to make as a woman writer who put a lot of myself into many of these characters. I felt like I was chopping off arms and limbs. But I challenged myself to bring those viewpoints back in to the narrative and to not lose them altogether. But that was really difficult. But it was the reality of a 4-generation family saga needing to move at a clip that would keep the reader engaged and also be authentic to the story and who were the primary drivers of the plot. And those were some of the interactions, mostly with the men and the world around them. So I tried to bring a female perspective to writing the male perspective, and also make sure that the women weren't lost wholesale. And that was a challenge, and it remains a difficult choice that I had to make.
And
For me, I think the best analogy I can use is when you're going to be eating a meal and you fill up your plate, at a point you have to stop. You just can't continue to add food to your plate, even if it's good, because your plate is full and the meal will be wonderful. And the rest of it, although maybe is also good, you can't put more on your plate. And the reader is having to, take this meal and consume it too. So it's a matter of looking at what the story itself. Have I told enough? Is it a good meal? And if it's a good meal, it's okay to start excising things that seem like they're too much for the plate. And I don't think of it as killing my darlings. I think of it as just when you try on clothes and something is okay, but this other thing fits better. You don't have to burn that other thing. You just put it back. You just put it back on the rack, and someone else can perhaps enjoy it. One thing I did with Only the Beautiful, which I might do with this book too, is I took the extra chapters for a character named Amaryllis. If you've read Only the Beautiful, you know who she is. There are about 20,000 words that did not make it into the final book. And I offer them as a PDF to readers who have read that book as sort of like my gift to you. So that if you read it and want it, just email me and I'd be happy to send that PDF to you. So it's sort of like a little extra novelette that allows those chapters to be heard, but they don't necessarily need to be a part of the book. And that was a great way for me to rationalize what I needed to do for the book's sake and still honor those chapters and those words.
Thank you. Some really good analogies. Well, we're up against the end of the hour here, so I'm going to wrap things up. Before I do, I have one more question for all of you. I always end the panel with one particular question. Before I get to that, I want to just say thank you again to our panelists. This has been a really wonderful discussion. Congratulations on all of your novels. Thank you to everyone who has attended. We hope that you're able to pick up one or two of these books. If you can't afford it, you can always support these authors by posting about it on your social media or just getting the copy from your local library or requesting that they carry it, anything like that. Everything helps to support these authors and these really valuable stories that they are writing. So what I want to end with is just why historical fiction. Often, all of you show that you do a ton of work that goes into researching these stories and putting them onto the page. And I'm sure you've all done enough research that you could write something nonfiction, could write something academic, but what is the value of turning it into a narrative? And even, as Penny said, changing the facts just a little bit to make sure that the reader is entertained. Fiona, if you could start, what is the value of historical fiction?
Yeah, as a kid, I loved the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And so I think for me, I want to be transported back in time and see what it was like. That's the value. I want to see how it compares to now. What did the clothes feel like? What were the foods they eat? And so I think you can read a biography and learn so much, but there's something really immersive about reading historical fiction where you identify so strongly with that character in a way that's emotional and fraught. And for me, I just love that journey.
Thank you, Fiona. Susan, how about you? What's the value of historical fiction?
Yeah, for me, I think historical fiction keeps the past alive in the most wonderful way. Historical fiction is a vehicle to the past. You can travel there safely from the comfort of your home. And keeping the past alive is important because there are some really valuable lessons that we've learned along the way, and we don't want to forget them. Some of those lessons were hard won, and they showed us perhaps flaws in our character. And so if we can go back and revisit the past and keep the lesson alive, then maybe we can avoid making the same mistakes a second time.
Yeah, I like that. Keep the lesson alive.
Mm-hmm.
Julia, how about you? Why did you write historical fiction?
Sure. Well, ditto to what the previous two speakers have said about what is compelling about historical fiction. I also think that what is the saying, life is stranger than fiction. And so going back and researching lives of those who sort of fall in between the cracks, I think is incredibly powerful. It brings voice to those who don't necessarily get to tell the history in the history books. And it allows us to perhaps wax a little philosophical, again, everything from what did the clothes feel like to what it was really like to be an immigrant, or really like to be an outsider, or really like to be the person who didn't get to tell their story. And I think that's a really important process just from a humanity perspective in making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and that we don't let the same people write the history over and over and over again.
Thank you, Julia. And finally, Penny, why historical fiction? What's the value there?
Well, I think I'm echoing what Julia said. History has the best stories. Why not use them? And for me, the wonderful thing, or one of the wonderful things of it, is that I've worked as a journalist for my whole life. So you're working with facts and what have you, and I love the idea of bringing readers to fact via fiction. That whole thing of people reading things and thinking, wow, I did not know this. I think Fiona was saying that before, that people kind of recognizing that they're learning something new. I love that idea. And yeah, what else can I say? I mean, that for me was particularly with these stories of women who have lived extraordinary, remarkable lives, whose stories haven't really been told up to now. And I think we spoke about it earlier, just also highlighting in some cases how little has changed, you know, that there are so many things that may have changed at some point, at some stage things go backwards and forwards, you know, nothing's necessarily always an upward curve. I love the idea when my husband read The Invincible Miss Cust, and he considers himself quite a well-read, insightful man, and he said, I didn't realize women had to suffer that much during the Victorian era. And I love the idea of people realizing that and maybe exploring it a bit further.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. And thank you to our panelists once again. This has been a really great discussion. And thanks everyone for attending. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi.